The smell of antiseptic hit me before the fear did. It always did. That sharp, clean scent that pretended everything inside those walls was controlled, measured, safe. I was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, my hands folded over my stomach, listening to the soft beeping of a monitor when I mentioned the name. Just once. Calmly, almost casually. Not an accusation, not a question meant to corner anyone. Just a name tied to a line in my medical file that didn't belong there. Daniel's head snapped up so fast I felt it before I saw it. "Get out," he barked, his voice cut through the room like a dropped tray. "Don't say that here, get out, now!" The hallway went silent. A nurse froze mid-step. Someone behind the curtain in the next bay stopped coughing. Daniel stepped in front of me, blocking the bed, his face pale in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not irritation, fear, raw, unfiltered fear. I stared at him, my mouth dry. "What are you afraid of?" I asked quietly. Too quietly, maybe, because his jaw tightened and he leaned closer, lowering his voice as if that would erase what had already happened. "Be quiet," he hissed. "You don't understand what you're touching." A nurse cleared her throat. Another avoided my eyes. And just like that, I was escorted out of the room where my unborn child was being monitored, standing in the corridor like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. Daniel didn't follow me. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look back. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. I wasn't being protected. I was being removed. I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, my feet dangling just above the floor, feeling the cold seep through my clothes. The hallway hummed with distant footsteps and murmured voices, but no one spoke to me. No one asked if I was okay. I watched a nurse glance in my direction, hesitate, then turn away. Whatever Daniel had projected in that room had worked. Authority, control, ownership. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Time stretched thin when you were left alone like that. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from the slow realization settling into my chest. That outburst hadn't been spontaneous. It had been defensive. Strategic. Daniel didn't lose control because I was wrong. He lost control because I was close. When he finally came out, his expression had reset. Calm, composed, the Daniel everyone trusted. He crouched in front of me, lowering himself to eye level like a concerned professional managing a situation. "You can't do that," he said evenly. "Not here, not in front of staff. This is a hospital, Lauren. Stress isn't good for you, or the baby." I searched his face for something familiar, remorse, concern, anything human. There was nothing there but calculation. "I didn't accuse you of anything," I said. "That's not the point," he replied. "You brought up something private in the wrong setting. You caught people off guard. Of course they reacted." They, not him. He framed the room as the problem, not his behavior. He placed responsibility neatly back into my hands where he expected it to stay. "I'm sorry," I said, because that was what he wanted to hear. The word came out flat, practiced, obedient. I watched his shoulders relax as if a switch had been flipped. "Good," he said softly. "Let's just get through this, okay?" I nodded. I always had, and that was my mistake. On the drive home, I replayed the scene over and over. The way his voice had echoed, the way no one intervened, the way he never denied the name, only the timing. Daniel was not a man who shouted. He was a man who measured, who optimized, who planned. That outburst didn't fit the data. By the time we reached the house, I had already decided not to ask another question. Not because I was afraid of the answers, but because I finally understood the rules of the game I had been playing without knowing it. Questions made him defensive. Silence made him careless. That night, while Daniel slept, I opened the patient portal on my phone. I didn't search his messages. I didn't dig through his email. I went straight to my own records, dates, codes, notes written in language meant to sound routine. And there it was again, the same name, attached to a category that had nothing to do with my care. I closed the screen and set the phone down, my heart steady in a way it hadn't been all day. The hospital hadn't exposed the truth. Daniel had. All I had done was say a name, and he had shown me exactly how much that name could destroy. Before the hospital, before the paperwork and the silence, and the name that shattered everything, I believed my marriage was balanced, not perfect, not romantic in a movie way, but stable, sensible, adult. I had built my life on structure long before Daniel entered it, and I thought that was why we worked. I had spent years in retail sales, the kind of work that teaches you discipline whether you want it or not. Early mornings, long shifts on your feet, quotas that didn't care about your mood. I learned to track every dollar because no one else was going to do it for me. Rent, groceries, savings, emergencies. I never carried debt. I never waited for someone else to fix a problem I could solve myself. Independence wasn't a slogan to me, it was survival. When I met Daniel, that independence felt seen. At least, that's what I told myself. He admired my organization, my spreadsheets, my routines. He said I was impressively responsible, like that was a rare trait. He talked about data the way some people talk about faith. Numbers didn't lie. Patterns always revealed themselves if you waited long enough. He made certainty sound comforting. Daniel worked as a data analyst, and he carried that role into every part of his life. Conversations were framed as probabilities, decisions were optimal outcomes, emotions were variables to be managed. In public, he was calm, measured, unshakable. Friends trusted him instinctively. Family members deferred to him without noticing they were doing it. He was the man people described as steady, the one you wanted in a crisis. At first, I liked that contrast between us. I handled the practical, he handled the strategic. It felt like teamwork. When we disagreed, he didn't raise his voice. He explained. He walked me through his reasoning step by step until my objections sounded emotional, imprecise, inefficient. I would nod, not because I was convinced, but because it felt easier to let logic win than to keep arguing a feeling I couldn't grasp. The shift was so gradual I didn't recognize it as a shift. Decisions about where we lived, how we spent weekends, which expenses were necessary and which were wants. Daniel never said no outright. He reframed. He suggested alternatives. He used phrases like long-term risk and exposure until my preferences sounded irresponsible even to me. I started asking questions differently, softer, framed around his comfort. Does that make sense? Instead of, I don't agree. It didn't feel like submission, it felt like compromise. That was the lie I lived with. Money was where I believed I still held ground. I kept my savings separate by choice, not secrecy. Daniel knew exactly what I had and where it was. I liked that transparency. It felt honest. When he suggested consolidating accounts for simplicity, I pushed back, gently. He accepted it with a smile that said he understood, and I mistook that for respect. Looking back, I see how often he returned to the topic. Not insistently, casually. As if it were an idea he was planting, not a demand he was making. He talked about alignment, about efficiency, about preparing for contingencies. I believed caution meant care. I believed planning meant protection. Then I got pregnant. It didn't happen easily. There were appointments, tests, conversations heavy with medical language. When the pregnancy was finally confirmed, I cried in the car. Relief washed over me in a way I hadn't expected. Daniel didn't cry. He smiled, nodded, and asked about timelines. What changed first wasn't his presence, but his focus. He attended every appointment, sat closest to the doctor, answered questions before I could. He spoke about protocols and compliance like he was managing a project. When forms were handed to me, he reached for them automatically, skimming faster than I could read. No one questioned it. He sounded confident. He sounded informed. He sounded like the person in charge. I noticed small things. How he referred to the pregnancy as the situation when we were alone. How he talked more about risk than about the baby. How my comfort seemed secondary to the plan. But I dismissed it. I told myself stress changed people. That this was new territory for both of us. There was a moment early on that I didn't think mattered. A document Daniel placed in front of me late one evening, explaining it was standard, just something to make sure everything ran smoothly if complications arose. I signed it without reading every line because I trusted him, and because I was tired, and because he said waiting would only make things harder later. Trust has a way of disguising itself as efficiency. The day Daniel shouted in that hospital room, the memory of all those moments came rushing back at once. His need for control, his obsession with timing, his intolerance for unpredictability. That outburst wasn't a deviation from who he was. It was the first time I saw him stripped of the calm that made everyone believe in him. As I lay awake that night, listening to his even breathing beside me, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. The man I married didn't lose control easily, and when he did, it was because control was being threatened. The hospital wasn't where our marriage broke. It was where the illusion finally did. I stopped asking questions after the hospital, not because I didn't want answers, but because I realized questions were the only thing Daniel couldn't fully control. He could redirect them, soften them, bury them under explanations, but they unsettled him. Silence, on the other hand, made him careless. So I became quiet. At first, Daniel mistook my silence for shock. He checked in with practiced concern, asking if I was feeling overwhelmed, reminding me how fragile pregnancy could be. He suggested rest, less screen time, fewer stressful topics. He framed it all as care, and I let him. I nodded when he spoke. I thanked him for handling things. I apologized again for the hospital, even though the word tasted wrong in my mouth. He accepted the apology the way someone accepts confirmation, calmly, with relief. Life returned to its routines, but I noticed how closely Daniel watched me now. Not anxiously, strategically. He paid attention to my energy, my moods, my questions, or the lack of them. When I didn't bring up the name again, his shoulders loosened. When I didn't ask about appointments he attended alone, he grew more confident. Control, to Daniel, was a pattern, and patterns required reinforcement. I reinforced the one he wanted. In private, I began observing instead. The way he handled paperwork, the way he spoke on the phone when he thought I couldn't hear, the precision of his calendar entries, meetings labeled vaguely, appointments scheduled back-to-back with just enough time to look legitimate. I wasn't searching for proof of betrayal. I was mapping behavior. One evening, while he showered, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The name flashed across the screen, half hidden by a notification preview. Kayla. Followed by a line that made no sense in the context he had given me. Something about rescheduling and documentation. I stood there longer than necessary, my hands steady, my breathing even. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no cinematic panic. Just confirmation, the kind that settles in your bones and makes everything else fall into place. Kayla wasn't a stranger. She was a professional, a physical therapist, according to Daniel. Someone who had appeared casually in conversations months earlier, always framed as part of a wellness routine, a recovery plan, a necessity. He mentioned her the way you mention a mechanic or a dentist, useful, neutral, temporary. But her name appeared too often, in too many contexts, on too many documents. The patient portal became my anchor, not his records, mine. I reviewed every appointment, every note, every referral. Medical language is designed to sound objective, but patterns reveal intention, repeated mentions, cross-referenced codes, annotations that didn't align with my condition. Kayla's name appeared in places it shouldn't have. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't mention it. I adjusted my behavior instead. I asked fewer questions. I deferred more. I let him take the lead in conversations with doctors. When he offered to handle forms, I handed them over without hesitation. I let him believe I was retreating. The change emboldened him. Daniel began speaking more openly, assuming my understanding without checking it. He referenced plans in the plural, including me without consulting me. He spoke about post-birth logistics as if they were already decided. Legal steps, financial arrangements. Just safeguards, he called them. Nothing to worry about. I worried quietly. One afternoon, he slid another document across the table. This time, I read every word, slowly, carefully. It was written in the kind of language designed to sound mutual while shifting power subtly in one direction. Terms like cooperation, compliance, best interest. It referenced earlier agreements I barely remembered signing. There it was again, a clause buried deep, framed as procedural, conditional, activated only under specific circumstances. Daniel glossed over it, summarizing with a sentence that minimized its importance. "It's standard," he said. "Just formalizes things if there are complications." I asked one question, just one. "What kind of complications?" He didn't answer directly. He never did when the answer mattered. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my laptop and searched for a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A specialist. Someone who understood contracts, family law, and financial protections. Someone who wouldn't be impressed by Daniel's credentials or intimidated by his confidence. The consultation was brief and quiet. I explained the situation without emotion, laying out facts the way Daniel would have appreciated. The lawyer listened, asked clarifying questions, then paused longer than I expected. "You're not imagining this," she said finally, "and you're not as exposed as he thinks." The sentence landed with weight. She explained the clause Daniel had minimized, the conditions under which it could be activated, the timeline that mattered, the protections it triggered if used correctly. It wasn't designed as a weapon. It was designed as a safeguard. One Daniel assumed I wouldn't recognize, let alone understand. He had planned around my ignorance. I ended the call without committing to anything. No paperwork, no action, just information. Knowledge was enough for now. In the days that followed, I paid attention to Daniel's confidence, how it grew as my silence continued, how he mistook my compliance for surrender. He was already moving ahead, assuming the path was clear. He never asked if I had read the documents. He never asked what I understood. He had built his plan on a familiar assumption. That assumption was me. Daniel's confidence grew the way mold does in a sealed room, quietly, invisibly. By the time you noticed it, it was already everywhere. He began narrating our life as if it were a process already approved. Conversations no longer ended with questions, only conclusions. "We'll handle it this way. That part's already taken care of. There's no need to revisit that." He spoke with the calm certainty of someone who believed every variable was accounted for. I made sure he believed I was one of them. I started asking him for help with things I already understood. Simple things, banking apps, appointment scheduling. I let him explain them slowly, patiently, the way you explain something to someone you think is overwhelmed. I nodded at the right moments. I thanked him for being so organized. I told him I was grateful he could think clearly when I couldn't. It felt like acting, but it wasn't exhausting. It was clarifying. The more dependent I appeared, the more Daniel relaxed. He stopped watching me as closely. He left documents on the kitchen counter instead of locking them away. He took phone calls in the living room instead of stepping outside. He began assuming my presence was harmless. Kayla appeared more often after that. Not directly. Not in a way anyone could point to and say something was wrong. She existed in Daniel's calendar, in passing comments, in scheduling conflicts explained away with professional language. "She's covering a slot." She adjusted the timeline. "She'll coordinate with the provider." Always she, never my therapist, never a name that invited scrutiny. Once I saw her in person. Daniel had arranged a consultation under the guise of recovery planning. I sat quietly in the chair, hands folded, listening as Kayla spoke with practiced warmth. She didn't look like a villain. She looked competent, calm, reassuring. The kind of woman people trusted without thinking too hard about why. She addressed Daniel directly most of the time. When she spoke to me, it was with a softness that felt rehearsed, pity dressed up as care. "We just want to make sure you're supported," she said, smiling. "This is a delicate time." I smiled back, weakly, gratefully. Daniel watched the exchange with satisfaction. Two pieces fitting neatly together. After that, Kayla stopped pretending I wasn't part of the conversation. She began referencing decisions as if they were shared, timelines, expectations, plans for after the birth. She spoke carefully but confidently, as if her role was already secured. Daniel didn't correct her. At home, the pressure increased subtly. Documents appeared more frequently. Deadlines crept closer. He framed urgency as necessity, not coercion. We need to finalize this before things get more complicated. It's better if everything's settled ahead of time. This protects all of us. All of us never meant me. I noticed how often he referenced my condition when explaining why speed mattered, how pregnancy became leverage, not concern. Stress was dangerous. Confusion was risky. Emotional instability was a liability. Each phrase placed the burden on me to comply for my own good. So I complied. Outwardly. Privately, I kept a calendar of my own, not his, mine, dates, times, conversations, who said what and when. I wrote nothing dramatic, no accusations, just facts, the kind that held weight when emotion was removed. I checked in with my lawyer again, briefly, quietly, no changes yet, just confirmation. The window was still open. The conditions were still unmet. Timing mattered more than intention. Daniel didn't know that. He thought the hardest part was over. One evening he brought up the hospital incident again, but not the way I expected. Not as an apology, as a justification. I lost my temper that day, he said, almost casually. But you have to understand, hospitals document everything. You can't introduce confusion like that. It creates a record. The word record hung in the air. I looked at him, careful to keep my expression neutral. I didn't think it mattered. It didn't, he said quickly. Not really, but it could have if it continued. There it was, not denial, warning. I nodded, eyes downcast. I won't bring it up again. He reached for my hand then, squeezing gently. Good, we're almost through this. Almost. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe, counting the seconds between inhales. I wasn't angry. Anger would have clouded things. I felt focused, centered. The way you feel before making a decision you've already made in your mind. Daniel believed control came from certainty, from eliminating unpredictability, from managing people like systems. What he never accounted for was patience. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to expose him. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone yet. All I needed was time. And the more confident he became, the more time he gave me. By the end of the week, Daniel scheduled what he called the final review, the last set of documents, the last signatures before everything was locked in. He smiled when he told me, relaxed, assured. I smiled back softer than before. Because by then, I knew something he didn't. Plans don't fail because someone fights them. They fail because someone waits. By the time Daniel scheduled what he called the final review, I understood the rhythm of his confidence. He believed momentum was on his side, that if he moved fast enough, certainty would replace doubt. He mistook speed for inevitability. I let him. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon, framed as a formality. Just a last pass, he said, tapping his calendar. After this, everything's settled. He spoke the words like a promise, like a relief he was offering me. I thanked him the way I always did now and asked if there was anything I should prepare. Just yourself, he said, smiling, and try not to overthink it. Overthinking had never been my problem, underestimating had. In the days leading up to the review, I leaned into the role he had assigned me. I asked for reassurance I didn't need. I voiced worries about money, about medical costs, about being able to manage after the birth. Daniel responded exactly as I expected. He explained, he minimized, he framed my concerns as natural but unnecessary. We've accounted for all of that, he said one evening, scrolling through a spreadsheet on his tablet. You're protected. Protected. The word landed differently now. I asked him to walk me through the documents again, slowly, as if I were struggling to follow. He obliged, clearly enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his mastery. He summarized sections, skipped others, and brushed past the clause I knew mattered most with a casual flick of his finger. That's just procedural, he said. It won't apply. Why not? I asked, keeping my voice small. Because it would require a very specific set of circumstances, he replied, "and those circumstances aren't happening." He said it with the certainty of someone who believed reality bent toward his expectations. Kayla's presence increased as the deadline approached. She didn't hide anymore. She called Daniel during dinner. She sent follow-up messages while we watched television. Her tone was efficient, confident, familiar. She spoke about timelines and next steps like someone already invested in the outcome. Once, she referred to me indirectly while on speakerphone. "If she's comfortable, we can move forward." I was sitting right there. Daniel glanced at me, waiting. I nodded. "Great," Kayla said. "Then we're on track." "On track for what?" She didn't say. She didn't need to. The night before the review, Daniel was almost gentle. He made dinner. He asked how I was feeling. He touched my shoulder as he passed behind my chair, a gesture meant to signal care. I thanked him again, out of habit more than intention. "Tomorrow's a big day," he said. "After that, we can all breathe." All of us. The phrase had started to feel hollow. I went to bed early, claiming exhaustion. Daniel stayed up, reviewing documents one last time, confident enough to do it in the open. I watched from the hallway as he worked, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried. He believed there were no loose ends left to tie. When I closed the bedroom door, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and replayed every conversation, every explanation, every assumption he had made about me, about my understanding, about my capacity, about my willingness to comply. He had built his plan on a version of me that existed only because I had allowed it to. The next morning, I woke calm, not nervous, not angry, calm in the way you are when you've already accepted an outcome. At the review, Daniel took the lead immediately. He spoke to the lawyer he had chosen, outlining the process with confidence. He answered questions directed at me before I could open my mouth. When documents were placed in front of me, he slid them closer, pointing to where I would sign. I read everything. Not dramatically, not slowly enough to draw attention, just thoroughly. Daniel mistook my focus for hesitation. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "It's all standard," he said. "We've been over this." "I know," I replied and meant it. He smiled, relieved. As the meeting progressed, Daniel grew more relaxed. He spoke openly about what came next. Logistics, transitions. He referenced decisions that would take effect immediately after the birth. He talked about authority as if it were already granted. No one contradicted him, not yet. When the meeting ended, Daniel stood and shook hands, confident in the assumption that everything was moving according to plan. Kayla sent a message before we even reached the car. A simple line. "We're almost there." Almost. On the drive home, Daniel talked about the future with ease. He spoke about efficiency, about stability, about minimizing disruption. I listened, nodding when appropriate, filing away every word. He didn't notice my silence anymore. He had stopped monitoring it. That afternoon, while Daniel took a call in his office, I stepped outside and sat on the porch. The air felt different, sharper, clearer. I checked my calendar one last time. Dates aligned, conditions met. The window was narrowing, but it was still open. I sent a brief message to my lawyer. No explanations, no emotion, just confirmation. The response came quickly. "Understood, we're ready." I set the phone down and rested my hand over my stomach, feeling a slow, steady movement beneath my palm. For the first time in weeks, my breath deepened. Daniel believed the review had secured his future. He believed momentum guaranteed outcome. He believed my silence meant surrender. What he didn't understand was that the review hadn't finalized anything. It had exposed everything. And while he celebrated the approach of the finish line, I had already stepped into position. Not to stop him, but to let him cross it first. I learned how to measure time differently after that. Not by days or appointments, but by how close Daniel thought he was to finishing what he'd started. Every conversation, every document, every confident smile told me exactly where he believed himself to be. And that told me where I was. Daniel became lighter, almost cheerful. The tension that had followed him for weeks dissolved into a calm satisfaction. He stopped double-checking details. He stopped guarding his phone. He talked more freely about what would happen after the baby arrived, outlining plans with the assurance of someone who believed the hardest work was behind him. He had no idea he was counting down the same clock I was. I continued playing my part. I asked him small questions about timing, not challenges, clarifications. When does that take effect? Is that before or after the next appointment? He answered easily, confidently, never realizing each answer confirmed what I already knew. He assumed my interest meant dependence. He assumed my attention meant fear. One evening, while he was explaining a schedule change, he casually mentioned a date, not as a deadline, as an assumption. By then, it'll all be finalized, he said, waving a hand as if the matter were closed. That date mattered. I didn't react. I simply nodded and asked him to repeat it, pretending I hadn't heard. He did, slightly amused. "You don't need to worry about dates," he said. "I've got it under control." I smiled, soft and grateful. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after Daniel went to bed, my laptop open, my calendar spread out beside me. I checked every detail again. The clause, the conditions, the timing, everything aligned with a precision that felt almost surreal. The lawyer had been clear. The clause only worked if activated before a specific threshold, not after, not during, before, and the documentation mattered just as much as the timing. The hospital incident, the language Daniel had used, the witnesses, the record he had warned me about. All of it pointed in the same direction. I didn't feel excitement. I felt steadiness, the kind that comes when uncertainty finally gives way to clarity. In the days that followed, Daniel grew bolder. He began referencing the agreement as settled fact. He spoke to me as if I were already bound by terms that hadn't fully taken effect yet. He reminded me of obligations I hadn't legally assumed. He framed compliance as inevitability. "You don't need to think about that anymore," he said once when I hesitated over a detail. "It's already handled." Handled by him, for him? Kayla's confidence mirrored his. She sent messages that assumed access. She referred to future arrangements as if they were locked in. She spoke about coordination and alignment with a familiarity that no longer bothered to hide. Once she mentioned something that stopped me cold. "Once the protections are finalized," she said over speakerphone, "we can proceed without interference." Interference. Daniel didn't correct her. He simply nodded, his attention on the screen in front of him. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. I said nothing. I didn't need to. That evening, Daniel poured himself a drink, something he rarely did during the week. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed, satisfied. "This went smoother than I expected," he said. "I was worried you might push back more." "I'm tired," I replied. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. He smiled. "I know, you've done really well." The praise landed like a verdict. I excused myself early, retreating to the bedroom with the familiar excuse of exhaustion. Daniel stayed behind, scrolling through his phone, answering messages, already moving forward in his mind. Alone, I checked my phone once more. No new messages, no surprises. Everything was ready. I thought about the hospital again, about the way Daniel's voice had echoed down the corridor, about the way no one had stepped in, about how easily authority was assumed when spoken loudly enough. That moment hadn't just revealed his fear. It had created a record, a line in a system he respected too much to consider dangerous. He had warned me not to create one. I closed my eyes and placed both hands over my stomach, grounding myself in the steady rhythm beneath my palms. This wasn't about punishing him. It wasn't about proving anything to Kayla. It wasn't even about revenge, not in the way people imagine it. It was about removing leverage. Daniel believed control came from anticipating every move, from shaping outcomes before they arrived, from staying ahead of the system. What he never considered was that the system didn't care who felt smartest in the room. It cared about timing, documentation, procedure, and patience. The next morning, Daniel kissed my forehead before leaving for work, a gesture meant to reassure both of us. "We're almost done," he said. "Just a little longer." I watched him walk out the door, his posture relaxed, his steps unhurried. He believed the window had already closed. I waited until the house was quiet, until the familiar sounds of his routine faded into distance. Then I sat down at the table, opened my laptop, and reviewed the final checklist one last time. Everything was in place. I didn't rush, I didn't hesitate. I simply waited. Because the moment Daniel thought was the end was only the point where he stopped paying attention. And that was exactly when the switch was designed to be thrown. Daniel started treating my agreement like a given, not something he waited for, but something he assumed would always arrive on time. He spoke to me less like a partner and more like a variable he had already solved. That was when he began asking for my signatures more casually. Not with urgency, with familiarity. He would slide papers across the table while talking about something else, pointing to where I needed to sign without breaking his sentence. The gesture said this was routine, unremarkable, beneath discussion. I picked up the pen every time, pausing just long enough to appear hesitant before complying. Each pause made him more patient, more confident. "You don't need to read all that," he said once, smiling. "It's the same language as before." "I know," I replied, and again I meant it. He started helping me more, taking over calls, canceling appointments I had scheduled for myself, and rebooking them at more convenient times. He framed it as care, as efficiency. I let him. The more he managed, the more he believed management was necessary. One afternoon he asked me if I wanted him to speak to my employer on my behalf about adjusting my schedule after the birth. The offer sounded generous, protective. But it carried the assumption that my independence was already slipping away. "That might be easier," I said. His relief was immediate. He leaned into that role quickly, spoke with authority, made decisions. He enjoyed the sense of control too much to hide it now. I watched him from the edges, noting how he no longer checked my reactions. He didn't need my approval anymore. He believed he already had it. Kayla's presence grew bolder alongside his confidence. She no longer waited for Daniel to initiate contact. She called directly, texted at odd hours, referenced conversations I hadn't been part of. She spoke as if my silence were consent. Once she showed up unannounced. Daniel had invited her, of course, under the guise of coordination. She arrived with a folder tucked under her arm, dressed professionally, moving through the house like she belonged there. She greeted me warmly, with the kind of smile that assumes there's no resistance left to encounter. "I just wanted to make sure we're all aligned," she said. Aligned, another word that erased disagreement. They spoke together at the kitchen counter, heads bent over documents, voices low and efficient. I sat at the table listening, occasionally asked for input and always giving it in the smallest possible way. A nod, a quiet agreement, a deferential smile. At one point, Kayla glanced at me and said, "You've been very cooperative. That makes things so much easier." Daniel smiled at that, proud, vindicated. The irony was almost unbearable. Later that evening, after Kayla left, Daniel poured himself another drink and leaned against the counter, visibly relaxed. "She's impressed," he said. "She wasn't sure how this would go." "How what would go?" I asked. "This," he replied, gesturing vaguely between us. "You understanding the situation." The situation. As if it were a weather pattern, not a plan built around my silence. "I trust you," I said. The words landed exactly as he wanted them to. He nodded, satisfied, and reached for my hand. His grip lingered longer than usual, possessive without being overt. "I knew you would," he said. From that point on, Daniel stopped disguising his timeline. He spoke about next steps openly, about what would happen immediately after the birth, about decisions that would be made quickly, efficiently, without debate. He framed everything as protection. For the baby, for me, for our future. He never framed it as choice. I let the days pass quietly. I asked for reassurance when it suited me. I expressed doubts that allowed him to explain. Each explanation revealed another assumption he had made, another corner he believed was already secured. He never asked if I had spoken to anyone, never considered that I might have my own counsel. He had built his entire strategy on a single belief, that I would never move without him knowing. One evening as we sat on the couch watching television, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled. "She says everything's ready," he said. "Everything?" I asked. He nodded. "We're just waiting on one last thing." I looked at him. "What's that?" He waved a hand dismissively, Timing. Timing. The word settled between us, heavy with meaning he didn't recognize. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from fear, from anticipation. Not excitement either, just readiness. The kind that comes when every piece is already in place, and all that remains is execution. I thought about how easily he had underestimated me, how he had confused silence with ignorance, compliance with consent, patience with weakness. He had never asked what I understood. He had only assumed what I didn't. The next morning, Daniel left early, energized, focused. He kissed my cheek, told me he'd call later, reminded me to rest. His confidence was complete now, unquestioned, unexamined. As the door closed behind him, the house fell quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade. Then I walked to the table, sat down, and opened my laptop. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second guess. There was nothing left to consider. Daniel believed the hardest part was getting me to agree. He never realized the moment I did was the moment his plan became irreversible. Not because I accepted it, but because I stopped trying to stop it. The morning everything shifted felt ordinary enough to be invisible. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet hum of a house where one person believed control had already been secured. Daniel called me mid-morning, his tone relaxed. "I'll be late," he said. "Wrapping up a few things." Wrapping up, another phrase that assumed completion. "Okay," I replied, "I'll be here." He hung up without asking how I felt. He didn't need to anymore. He believed my role had been finalized. I spent the afternoon doing nothing that would draw attention. I folded laundry, I answered a few work emails, I made a list of groceries we didn't need. Ordinary actions are excellent camouflage. They make time pass without resistance. Around 3, I received a message from Kayla, not through Daniel, directly. "Just checking in," it read. "We're almost at the finish line." The confidence in her words was unguarded now. She no longer bothered to frame herself as peripheral. She believed the structure Daniel had built would hold, and that belief had made her careless. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the folder I had created weeks earlier. Not a dramatic dossier, just a clean collection of documents, contracts, notes, timelines. The hospital record, annotated but untouched. Everything labeled plainly, the way systems prefer. I reviewed the checklist once more. Each item ticked off quietly. Nothing left unresolved. No assumptions untested. No steps left to chance. At 4:30, Daniel came home early, earlier than he'd said he would. He looked pleased, almost buoyant. He loosened his tie, dropped his keys on the counter, and poured himself a drink without asking if I wanted one. "It's done," he said, "or close enough." "Close enough?" I asked. He smiled. "The important parts are locked in. There's nothing left to derail it." Derail, as if the outcome were a train already past the point of no return. He sat beside me on the couch, his body angled toward the television, his attention already elsewhere. "You did really well," he added. "I know this wasn't easy for you." I nodded. "I'm glad it's over." "So am I," he said. "We can finally move forward." Forward for him meant acceleration. For me, it meant alignment. That evening, Daniel reviewed a few last messages, replying quickly, confidently. He didn't hide his screen. He didn't lower his voice. He had nothing left to protect. He believed protection was his to give, not something he needed. When he went to bed early, exhausted from a day he thought had secured his future, I stayed up. Not anxiously, methodically. I opened my laptop and logged into the portal my lawyer had set up. The interface was plain, unemotional, designed for precision, not drama. I followed the steps exactly as instructed, no improvisation, no commentary. I attached the documentation, I selected the clause, I confirmed the timing. Then I paused. Not from doubt, from awareness. This was the last moment where nothing had changed yet. The last quiet before a shift Daniel would feel but not understand. I thought about the hospital corridor again, about the echo of his voice, about the nurse who looked away, about the word record, the way he had said it like a threat. I clicked submit. There was no sound, no confirmation beyond a simple line of text acknowledging receipt. The system didn't congratulate me. It didn't warn me. It simply accepted the action and moved it forward. That was it. I closed the laptop and went to bed. Daniel slept soundly beside me, unaware that the permissions he assumed were permanent had already begun to change, that the access he relied on was being quietly reevaluated, that the authority he wielded so comfortably had just been redirected through a channel he hadn't bothered to examine. The next morning, nothing appeared different. We ate breakfast. We exchanged routine comments. Daniel checked his phone, replied to messages, smiled at something Kayla had sent. Then his smile faded. "That's strange," he said, scrolling back. "It's probably a delay." "What is?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He stood pacing slightly, refreshing a screen that no longer responded the way he expected. "Access is restricted," he muttered. "That doesn't make sense." I sipped my coffee, keeping my expression neutral. He tried again, then again. His movements grew sharper, less controlled. The calm that had defined him began to crack around the edges. "I'll call them," he said, already dialing. "This shouldn't be happening." Shouldn't. I watched him from the table, noticing how quickly certainty dissolves when it meets procedure. The system didn't argue with him. It didn't explain itself. It simply enforced the rules he had assumed were irrelevant. When he hung up, his face was pale. "They're saying there's a hold," he said slowly. "Pending review." A review he had triggered, a record he had created, a timeline he had misread. I set my cup down gently. "Maybe it's just paperwork," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in weeks. "This isn't right," he said. "Something's off." He was right. But it wasn't off. It was exact. And while Daniel stood there, trying to understand how control could slip through his fingers without a fight, I realized something else. The switch hadn't exploded. It had locked. And now, everything he thought was finished had just begun to unravel. Daniel spent the rest of that morning trying to explain the problem away. First to himself, then to me. He blamed systems, delays, miscommunications. He spoke the way people do when they still believe authority will answer if they ask the right way. I let him talk. "I'll get it fixed," he said, pacing the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. "It's probably a temporary flag. Someone entered something incorrectly." He smiled at me between calls, a reassuring gesture meant to keep me calm. "Don't worry," he added. "These things happen." I nodded. I looked worried. I asked if there was anything I could do to help. That question changed everything. Daniel paused mid-step and looked at me. Really looked, as if assessing a resource he hadn't needed to consider before. "Actually," he said slowly, "there might be." He sat down across from me at the table and pulled out his laptop. His voice softened, took on that careful tone he used when he believed cooperation was still possible. "There are a few things we can clarify," he said, "just to speed things up." Clarify was his word for undo. He walked me through screens I had already seen, explaining access points that no longer responded. He asked me questions framed as memory checks. Did I recall signing this? Did I remember agreeing to that? He wasn't accusing yet. He was searching for a gap he could slip through. "I might need you to confirm something," he said, "just to show alignment." Alignment again, always that word. I leaned forward, studying the screen as if confused. "I thought you said everything was finalized," I said carefully. "It is," he replied too quickly. "Mostly. This is just procedural." Procedural. The same word he had used to dismiss the clause he never read closely enough. As the day wore on, Daniel's tone shifted. The calls grew shorter, the smiles faded, his confidence thinned into irritation. Kayla called twice. He ignored the first call, took the second in another room. I heard her voice through the door, sharp now, no longer careful. "What do you mean restricted?" she said. "That doesn't make sense." Daniel's reply was low and tight. "I'm handling it." When he came back, his composure was gone. "They're asking questions," he said. "Unnecessary ones." "What kind of questions?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "About authority," he said finally. "About consent." The word hung between us. I placed my hands on the table. steady, deliberate. I thought consent was already covered. It was, he snapped, then caught himself. He inhaled, forced his voice back into control. It is. This is just an audit. An audit he hadn't planned for. By evening, Daniel stopped pretending this was routine. He sat across from me, shoulders tense, eyes calculating. Did you talk to anyone? He asked. I met his gaze calmly. Who would I talk to? He searched my face for tells, fear, guilt, something. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. You've been different, he said slowly, since the hospital. I was embarrassed, I replied. You told me not to make records. That landed. His jaw tightened. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker behind his eyes, not about me, about himself. Kayla arrived unannounced an hour later. She didn't knock the way guests do. She knocked the way people do when they believe access is guaranteed. Daniel opened the door with forced calm. Kayla stepped inside, her confidence visibly shaken. What's going on? She demanded. They're freezing everything. I can't move forward. Daniel glanced at me, then back at her. Lower your voice. She ignored him. You said this was handled. It was, he said. Something changed. Her eyes slid to me, not with suspicion, with calculation. She was reassessing her assumptions in real time. Did you do something? She asked me, not accusing, just checking. I shook my head gently. I followed instructions. Daniel's face went pale. That was the moment the room shifted. Kayla saw it too. She straightened, stepping back slightly, as if distance might protect her. You said she didn't understand, she said quietly. You said she wouldn't notice. Daniel didn't answer. The silence told her everything. Kayla gathered her things without another word. No confrontation, no apology, just retreat. She had never been loyal to Daniel. She had been loyal to the plan. And the plan was bleeding out. After she left, Daniel sat heavily on the couch, rubbing his temples. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered. No, I said softly, it wasn't. He looked up at me then, truly afraid now. What did you do? I didn't answer, not because I couldn't, but because he didn't deserve the satisfaction of understanding yet. Knowledge had been his weapon. Silence would be mine. I just did what you told me, I said. I stayed quiet. I didn't interfere. That was when he understood the trap. He stood abruptly, pacing again, voice rising. You knew, he said. You knew something. I stayed seated, calm. I knew enough. The anger that followed was brief and useless. The system didn't care how loudly he protested. The calls didn't resolve anything. The access didn't return. The authority he relied on refused to answer on his terms. By midnight, Daniel stopped trying to fix things. He sat alone at the table, staring at his laptop, refreshing screens that no longer obeyed him. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now, hollowed out. I went to bed without saying goodnight. As I lay there, listening to his footsteps slow in the other room, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not relief, resolve. The performance was over. The weakness he had relied on had done its job. Daniel had believed surrender was the end. He never imagined it was the setup. And now, with the clock still ticking and his options closing fast, I knew the next move wouldn't be mine to make. It would be his. And every choice left to him would only tighten the lock he had never seen coming. The first thing Daniel did the next morning was read the contract again. Not skim it. Not summarize it the way he always had. He read it the way people do when something they trusted has betrayed them. I watched from the kitchen as he sat at the dining table, coffee untouched, laptop open, papers spread out in a disorder that didn't match his personality. His finger traced lines of text he had once dismissed as irrelevant. His jaw tightened as he reached the section he had waved away with a sentence and a smile. That can't be right, he muttered. I said nothing. He flipped back a page, then forward again, rereading the same paragraph as if repetition might change its meaning. The clause was still there. It hadn't moved. It hadn't transformed overnight. It had simply waited, patient and exact, for the conditions he had created himself. Daniel stood abruptly, grabbing his phone and dialing a number he had avoided the night before. The call went to voicemail. He tried another, then another. Each unanswered ring chipped away at the certainty he had built his life on. "They should have told me," he said aloud, "more to the room than to me. There's no way this activates without notice." "There was notice," I replied quietly. He turned to me, eyes sharp. "From who?" I met his gaze. "From you." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. His mind was racing, recalculating probabilities that no longer applied. By mid-morning, the emails began arriving. Formal, neutral, carefully worded. Notifications of holds, reviews, temporary restrictions pending verification. Each message referenced documentation, timelines, and behavioral records. No emotion, no blame, just procedure. Daniel read them one by one, his shoulders slumping slightly with each new confirmation. "This is reversible," he said, more to reassure himself than me. "It has to be." I didn't correct him. When his lawyer finally called back, Daniel stepped outside to take the call. He paced the length of the driveway, voice low but tense. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture. The way he leaned forward, as if proximity could force agreement. The way his free hand clenched and unclenched. The call ended abruptly. He came back inside slowly, his face drained of color. "They're saying the window's closed," he said. "That the clause was activated before finalization." "Yes," I said. "How?" His voice cracked on the word. "You couldn't have—" "I followed the process," I interrupted. "The one you explained to me." He stared at me, disbelief giving way to something darker. "You went behind my back." "No," I said calmly. "I went through the system." That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. Daniel sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "This affects everything." "I understand exactly what I've done," I replied. "I protected myself." He laughed then, a sharp, humorless sound. "Protected yourself from me?" I thought of the hospital corridor. The nurse who wouldn't meet my eyes. The word record, spoken like a warning. "Yes," I said, "from you." The silence stretched between us, thick and unfamiliar. Daniel had always filled silence with explanation, with logic, with reassurance. Now he had nothing left to offer. By afternoon, the consequences began to materialize. Accounts he assumed he controlled were frozen pending review. Authorizations he relied on were suspended. Decisions he believed were settled were suddenly open to scrutiny. Every shortcut he had taken now led to a dead end. Kayla called again. This time he answered on speaker without thinking. "They're blocking everything," she said, her voice tight. "What did you do?" Daniel closed his eyes. "I didn't do anything." Her breath hitched. "Then who did?" Neither of us answered. The silence was answer enough. "I can't be part of this," Kayla said after a moment. "This isn't what you promised." The line went dead. Daniel didn't move. He didn't react. He just stared at the phone in his hand, the last illusion of control slipping through his fingers. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. Later that evening, an email arrived from my lawyer. Short, precise, confirmation that the clause was fully in effect, that financial autonomy was secured, that Daniel's leverage had been neutralized. I read it once, then closed the laptop. Daniel watched me from across the room. "So that's it," he said quietly. "You planned this." "I prepared," I corrected. "You planned." The difference mattered. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. There was no argument left that hadn't already been answered by process and timing. He had lost not because I had confronted him, but because I had understood him. As night fell, the house grew quiet again. Daniel retreated into himself, scrolling through screens that no longer obeyed him, refreshing pages that wouldn't change. The system didn't respond to anger. It didn't negotiate. It simply enforced what had been set in motion. I went to bed early, exhausted in a way that felt clean instead of draining. As I lay there, I realized something that surprised me. The switch hadn't felt dramatic. It hadn't required strength or rage or even courage. It had required patience. And once thrown, it didn't explode. It locked. And everything Daniel believed he controlled had been sealed on the other side. The collapse didn't arrive all at once. It came in delays, in unanswered emails, in the subtle shift of how people spoke to Daniel when he reached out expecting deference and received caution instead. He spent the first days pacing between rooms, phone glued to his hand, repeating the same explanations to different voices. "It's a temporary hold. There's been a misunderstanding. We're clarifying it." Each sentence sounded thinner than the last. Institutions that once responded instantly now replied with forms, with cues, with timelines that refused to bend. I watched quietly. Daniel's confidence had always relied on momentum. When the momentum stalled, so did he. He started waking earlier, sleeping less. Coffee went cold beside him as he reread messages, scanning for loopholes that weren't there. His language changed. Certainty softened into irritation, irritation into worry. One afternoon he closed his laptop with a sharp snap and looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "We could have talked." "We did talk," I replied. "You just decided the outcome before I finished speaking." He flinched, as if the words had landed somewhere tender. "You're making me look like a monster." "You did that yourself," I said, not unkindly. "I just stopped covering for it." The phone rang again. He answered on the second ring this time, voice tight. I could hear enough to know the tone on the other end wasn't friendly. Questions about conduct, about documentation, about authority, about whether he understood the implications of his actions. When the call ended, Daniel slumped back into the chair. "They're treating me like a risk," he said, incredulous. "Like I can't be trusted." I thought of the hospital corridor, the way he had raised his voice, the way the room had frozen. Trust had always been conditional. He had just assumed he was exempt from the conditions. His professional world began to reflect the same hesitation. Meetings postponed, decisions deferred. People asked for confirmation in writing. His reputation, once effortless, now required defense. He wasn't accused. He was questioned. And for a man who lived on control, questions were worse than blame. Kayla stopped calling. At first, Daniel assumed it was tactical. Space. Strategy. Then days passed without a word. He sent a message, then another. Both went unread. Her silence spoke with clarity he hadn't expected. She hadn't been loyal to him. She had been loyal to the version of him that promised certainty. When that version disappeared, so did she. The legal confirmations arrived quietly, one after another. Formal notices, clear language, protections acknowledged, boundaries enforced. Each email closed another door Daniel had counted on leaving open. Each one restored a piece of my autonomy he had treated as negotiable. My lawyer's final message was brief. Everything I needed to know fit into 2 sentences. The protections were active, the leverage was gone. I felt relief then, but not triumph. Safety has a different weight than victory. It settles instead of soaring. Daniel tried once more to regain footing. He suggested mediation, framed as cooperation. He hinted at reconciliation, framed as stability. He talked about the baby, framed as shared responsibility. I listened without interrupting, then told him I would make decisions through counsel from now on. "That's not necessary," he said too quickly. "It is," I replied. The hospital incident returned, reframed by professionals who spoke calmly about impact and appropriateness. Witness statements, records, language stripped of emotion and reduced to facts. Daniel's outburst, once dismissed as stress, now sat in a file labeled coercive behavior. Not dramatic, just accurate. He never raised his voice again after that. At night, the house felt different. Quieter, but not empty. The silence wasn't tension anymore. It was distance. Daniel moved through rooms carefully, as if uncertain where he was allowed to stand. The man who once narrated our life now avoided conversation altogether. I focused on my health, on the steady progress of a body doing what bodies do when given room to breathe, on small routines that reminded me I was still myself outside of conflict. One evening, Daniel stood in the doorway and watched me pack a bag for an overnight stay with a friend. "You're leaving," he said, stating it like a discovery. "For a night," I replied, "I need space." He nodded, accepting the limitation without argument. That, more than anything, told me the collapse was complete. By the end of the week, Daniel wasn't planning anymore. He was reacting. The difference was visible in every movement. Plans require confidence. Reaction requires permission. I lay in bed that night, listening to the house settle, and felt the last thread of fear loosen its grip. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was no longer precarious. The plan that had once wrapped itself around my silence had unraveled without spectacle. No shouting, no confrontation, just consequences arriving on schedule. The collapse wasn't loud. It was thorough. And for the first time since the hospital, I slept without rehearsing what I might have to defend in the morning. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar at first. Not empty, not tense, just still. The kind of stillness that settles after something heavy has finally been set down. I woke up earlier than usual and sat by the window, watching the street come to life. Cars passed. A neighbor walked her dog. Ordinary moments resumed their place in the world, indifferent to what had unraveled inside my house. That indifference felt comforting. It reminded me that my life was larger than the conflict that had consumed it. Daniel moved through the mornings carefully now. He didn't announce plans. He didn't offer solutions. He asked before speaking, as if permission had become something he finally understood. We shared space without sharing control. That, more than any document or ruling, told me where things stood. I didn't feel victorious, I felt intact. There's a difference people don't talk about. Victory asks for an audience. Integrity doesn't. Integrity just needs room to exist again. I thought about everything I had lost along the way. Trust, yes. Time, certainly. The version of a marriage I believed in. I let myself mourn those things without trying to turn them into lessons too quickly. Loss deserves honesty, not spin. But I also named what hadn't been taken from me. My judgment, my discipline, my ability to learn and adapt. Those had been there all along, even when I doubted them, even when I allowed someone else to speak louder than I did. For a long time I believed endurance was love, that patience meant loyalty, that staying quiet kept things together. I know better now. Silence can protect, but only when it's chosen. When it's imposed, it becomes a tool for someone else. Pregnancy has a way of clarifying priorities. It forces you to ask what kind of world you're preparing to bring someone into. I realized I didn't want to model obedience dressed up as peace. I wanted to model awareness, boundaries, the courage to understand what you're agreeing to before you agree to it. Family, I learned, isn't about who manages whom best. It's about safety, emotional safety, legal safety, the kind of safety that doesn't disappear the moment you ask an inconvenient question. What surprised me most wasn't how the plan failed. It was how ordinary the mechanism was that stopped it. No confrontation, no dramatic reveal. Just systems doing what they're designed to do when someone takes the time to understand them. Power doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to wait and when to act. Sometimes it looks like trusting your own comprehension even when someone else insists you don't have it. That's the truth I carry forward now. A very American truth, grounded in process and preparation. Rights don't protect you if you don't know them. Plans don't fail because they're evil. They fail because they rely on assumptions that eventually crack. Daniel's plan relied on my silence, on my hesitation, on my belief that understanding was his domain, not mine. It unraveled the moment I stopped confusing quiet with consent. Life after that realization isn't loud. It's deliberate. I make choices with care now, not fear. I ask questions without apologizing for them. I read what I sign. I listen to my instincts when something doesn't align, even if it's presented with confidence and calm. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, you're not alone. Many of us have been taught to minimize ourselves to keep things running smoothly, to trust someone else's certainty over our own discomfort, to believe that preparation is suspicion and silence is strength. It doesn't have to be that way. If this story made you reflect on moments when you stayed quiet, or times you felt managed instead of respected, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what stood out to you in the comments, or what you recognized in your own experience. These conversations matter more than people admit. And if you want to stay with this channel for more real stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and justice that doesn't need applause, you're welcome here. Take a moment to like the video if it resonated, and consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Sometimes the most important changes don't announce themselves. They happen when you finally understand what silence can do, and what it no longer will. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.